The call came in at 1642. Not a training alert, not a drill, the kind of call that makes the air in a room go thin, the kind where the officer reading the telemetry looks at the screen twice because he does not want to be the man who says it out loud. 4 armored carriers, 2 electronic jamming trucks, a screen of light anti-air vehicles running escort. They were moving fast, disciplined, deliberate, straight through Devil's Backbone Pass in southwestern Colorado. Straight toward Blue Mesa Dam. The math was simple, and it was terrible. If that convoy reached the spillway, the charges they carried would bring down a structure holding back 11 billion gallons of water. In the valley below, a town of 12,000 people was finishing its Tuesday evening. Kids sitting down to dinner. Old men watching the news. Nobody down there knew that 6 miles up the canyon, something was coming that could not be reasoned with, could not be negotiated with, and did not care about any of them. 9 minutes. That was all the margin that existed between the world as it was and the world as it would never recover from being. F-16s were scrambled from Peterson, 2 of them fast and capable and flown by pilots who were good at their jobs. They went in hard and came back with nothing. The jamming signal from those 2 trucks at the center of the convoy was unlike anything the electronic warfare officers had seen deployed on American soil. It did not just disrupt targeting. It blinded every system the Vipers carried, turned their avionics into noise, made their missiles dumb. The canyon walls made things worse. At the speeds an F-16 needed to stay alive in that terrain, there was no time to think. No room to turn, no margin for the kind of slow and deliberate low-altitude work that destroying a convoy in a narrow pass actually required. They could not stay low enough. They could not fly slow enough. And the jammers ensured that nothing they carried could find a target anyway. On the ridge above the pass, a 4-man SEAL recon team lay flat in the dust and watched through their optics. Their commander, a lean man named Garrett Tulloch, kept his voice level as he reported into the net. Level did not mean calm. Level meant he was doing what trained men do when the situation has outrun the available solutions, managing the space between what he felt and what he said. All close air support assets be advised. Convoy is making 7 miles per hour through the lower section. Jammers are fully active. We cannot laze. I say again, we cannot laze. You have 1 viable pass window remaining before they reach the dam approach shield. After that, no ordnance can be employed over civilian infrastructure. Static answered him. Down on the flight line at Holloway Air Force Base, 50 miles northwest, pilots were running for their jets. Ground crews sprinted between aircraft. The tower was routing information faster than people could process it. There was noise and motion and the specific controlled chaos of a base that had just received a mission that did not fit neatly into any rehearsed scenario. Nobody looked toward Hangar 3. At the far end of the flight line, where older aircraft sat in the shadows between maintenance cycles, a woman in faded green coveralls crouched beside the nose gear of a plane that had not been glamorous since the Cold War. She had a penlight between her teeth and a torque wrench in her right hand and a checklist balanced on her knee. Her badge said contractor. Her hand said she had been doing this for a long time. The grease under her fingernails was the kind that does not wash out no matter how hard you scrub. Nobody knew her name. That was exactly how Nora Calloway preferred it. The A-10 Thunderbolt II designated tail number 707 had been old when Nora first laid hands on it 17 years ago. It was older now. The airframe had gone through 2 major depot overhauls, 3 engine replacements, and more patches than anyone had bothered counting carefully. Its paint was dulled by years of desert sun and blowing grit. The original gray faded to something closer to old bone. The shark mouth painted on its nose had been touched up twice by maintenance crews who lacked the original stencils and had done their best from memory, which meant it looked slightly different on the left side than the right, meaner on the left, almost smiling on the right. Nobody else noticed this. Nora had noticed it years ago and never mentioned it. Just behind the shark mouth, low on the fuselage where the curve of the nose met the first flat panel of the forward section, there was a scar. Not paint damage, a real scar. A depression in the aluminum skin about the size of a man's palm where something had hit hard enough to deform the metal without penetrating it, then been hammered back to rough flatness by someone with a mallet who wanted it flyable, not beautiful. Kunar Valley, 11 years ago. Nora touched it the way you touch something that has long since stopped hurting, but has never stopped meaning something. A brief private gesture done without breaking the rhythm of her work. Then she went back to the checklist. She had been at Holloway for 4 years under a civilian maintenance contract as unremarkable as she had worked to make herself. She knew the base the way you know a place when you arrive, intending to disappear into it, every shortcut, Every shift rotation, every corner where you could stand for 5 minutes without anyone asking what you were doing. She knew which pilots were careful with their pre-flights and which ones were sloppy. She knew which crew chiefs took pride in their work and which were counting down to the end of their enlistment. She knew things about the aircraft on this flight line that some of the men who flew them did not know. Nobody asked how she knew. She wore the coveralls and carried the clipboard and showed up before anyone else in the morning, and that was enough. The young pilots walked past her the way you walk past furniture that has always been in the same place without registering that it had ever not been there. She had cultivated this invisibility deliberately over a long time at significant cost. It was the cost she was still paying. The siren changed tone. There are different sirens on a military airbase, and any person who has spent time on one learns to distinguish them. The first tone, single high brief, makes you pause. The second tone is lower and longer, and it reaches into the back of your brain where the instincts live and pulls something awake that does not go back to sleep easily. Nora set down her torque arc wrench. Across the ramp, pilots froze mid-conversation, heads turning toward the tower. Ground crews set down tools. The particular stillness of people waiting for information they already know from the sound they will not like. The PA system came on. The voice was clipped, fast, deliberate. Multiple hostile vehicles. Devil's Backbone pass. Electronic countermeasures active. Estimated arrival. Blue Mesa Dam 9 minutes. All close air support assets scramble. For exactly 1 second, the base held its breath. Then it erupted. Nora did not move. She stood beside tail 707 and looked west toward the horizon where the canyon country began and the light was turning copper in the late afternoon. She knew that pass. She had studied terrain maps of this entire region when she first arrived at Holloway because studying terrain maps was something she had never been able to stop doing. She knew how the canyon narrowed in its lower section and how the walls caught sound and returned it doubled. She knew what it would do to a fast jet trying to work a target. She knew exactly why the F-16S had failed. On the open channel now, routing through every speaker on the flight line, Garrett Tulloch's voice came through from the ridge, rougher than the tower, closer to the ground. This is SEAL Recon, all stations. F-16 SOS are blind. Jammer signal is stronger than anything in our database. You need something that can fly slow and low and take a hit and still function. 1 pass window remaining. After that, no shot. A crew chief 20 yards from Nora shouted toward the tower. Who's current on this hog? Anyone who's checked out on the A-10 silence. Other voices tried other options. Drones could not punch through the jamming. Helicopters could not survive the anti-air. The faster jets had already proven what fast jets were worth in that canyon. The crew chief again louder with an edge under it now. Somebody tell me there's a rated pilot on this base who can fly the A-10. Nora heard the words leave her mouth before she had consciously decided to say them. I can. Every head within 30 feet turned. She was already reaching for the lanyard around her neck, lifting the badge, holding it, where the crew chief could read it. He was a compact man in his mid-30s whose face did not show much, and right now it showed skepticism moving quickly towards something harder. Ma'am, are you even? Read the card. He read it. She watched his face move through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. The skepticism did not disappear, but it became complicated. He looked up at her, then back at the card, then up again. Nora Calloway, former 74th Fighter Squadron. Call sign, Shadow 7. From somewhere in the small crowd that had gathered mechanics, crew chiefs, a pair of young pilots, still in flight suits, one of the older avionics technicians, a gray-haired man with 25 years of service visible in the set of his shoulders, said it quietly. Shadow 7? Not a question. Recognition. The name landing the way names land, when they have weight behind them, not loud but solid. Colonel Sterling Vance's voice cut in from the tower channel, authoritative and measured, a voice built by decades of command into something that conveyed information and priority without waste. Calloway, you are not on flight status. You are not on any active roster on this installation. Nora kept her eyes on the horizon. Sir, your fighters cannot make that turn. Your drones cannot survive the jamming. That aircraft in Bay 14 can do both. A breath. And so can I. The static lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. It is a very long time when 12,000 people have 8 minutes. Vance's voice came back lower. Carrying weight it had not carried before. Crew her. Load high explosive incendiary and AGM-65s. Full GAU-8 drum, Calloway. A pause. You have 1 run. Do not miss. The hangar came alive. They worked the way good ground crews work, under genuine urgency, without wasted motion, without unnecessary words, with the focused efficiency that looks almost calm from a distance and is anything but. Ammunition belts fed into the aircraft's belly with practiced hands, the massive rotary drum of the GAU-8 Avenger cycling through its loading sequence. Each 30-millimeter shell was as long as a man's forearm. There were 1,100 of them. The Maverick missiles went under the wings on their rails, locked and checked again. Fuel hoses connected and disconnected. Panels opened and closed. Nora walked toward the aircraft while all of this happened around her. She had walked toward this specific aircraft, or ones very much like it, more times than she could count, but not in 11 years. Not since she had walked into a windowless office in Virginia and sat down across from a colonel she barely knew and told him quietly and without elaboration that she was done, that she was requesting removal from flight status, that she had her reasons and was not prepared to discuss them. He had accepted it. The paperwork moved. She went away. She had told herself in the months that followed that it was the right decision. She had told herself that for 11 years, with the consistency of someone who knows that the story they keep telling themselves is doing necessary work even if they are not entirely sure the story is true. She paused at the nose of the aircraft, the shark mouth, the scar from Kunar Valley. She put her palm flat against the metal just above it, the way you rest your hand on the shoulder of something that has been through a great deal alongside you. "One more time," she said, quiet enough that only the aircraft could hear it. She climbed the ladder. 8 rungs. Her hands and feet found them, without thought. The cockpit wrapped around her with the physical logic of a space designed for one specific person and shaped by years of that person inhabiting it. The seat. The harness run through by feel each buckle finding its click with the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. The throttle under her left hand, the stick under her right. She scanned the instruments, not item by item but all at once, looking for anything out of the ordinary, trusting the whole picture before trusting any single detail. The engines began to spool. The sound started low and built into something you felt in your sternum before you heard it clearly, a deepening vibration that moved through the airframe and through the seat and into her body. Old sound, familiar as a voice. Shadow 7 Tower, you are cleared for immediate taxi. Devil's Backbone ingress, good hunting. She settled her hands on the throttle and the stick. The seat held her the way it had always held her. The instruments read back with the flat honesty of systems that report what is true and expect the person reading them to act on it. "Copy that," she said. She eased the throttles forward. Tail 707 rolled out of Hangar 3 into the last copper light of the afternoon. But to understand what happened in that canyon, you have to go back. You have to go back 11 years to a different canyon in a different country, to a morning when the light came in low and sideways, and the dust that was always in the air caught it and turned everything the color of pale fire. Kunar Valley, Afghanistan. Nora had been 33 years old with 8 years of combat flying behind her and a reputation in the 74th Fighter Squadron she had not sought and could not have shaken if she had tried. She was the pilot other pilots called when the geometry of a mission was unusual, when the target was awkward, when the terrain made standard approach profiles useless. She understood the A-10 the way a craftsman understands tools developed over years of intimate use, not just technique, but character. She knew what the aircraft could do at the edge of its limits. More importantly, she knew the difference between the edge of the aircraft's limits and the edge of her own. Her wingman that morning was First Lieutenant Warren Holt. Warren was 30 years old, good-looking in an uncomplicated way, and funnier than anyone expected when they first met him. He had a habit of drawing small cartoon figures in the margins of mission briefing documents, animals mostly in states of mild catastrophe, that he would try to slide across the table to Nora during the parts of the briefing where the information was mostly review. She had learned to keep her face neutral when she received these. It had taken discipline at first. It became something she looked forward to. He was also an excellent pilot, careful without being timid, aggressive when the moment called for it, measured when it did not. They had been flying together for 14 months. The mission that morning was escort and close air support for a resupply column pushing up the valley to a firebase that had been taking indirect fire for 10 days. Standard work. The kind that becomes routine when you have done it enough times without the worst happening. They were 20 minutes in when the situation changed. The radio call from the mission commander came in flat and unambiguous. Threat development in the upper valley. Rules of engagement shift in effect. All air assets were to break off and return to base. Immediately. No exceptions, no discretion at unit level. Nora heard it. Confirmed receipt. Began the sequence of banking away from the valley. In the seconds between receiving that order and completing her turn, she saw what was below her. A vehicle had broken down on the valley floor 200 meters short of a bend in the road. Around it, 4 soldiers from the resupply column were out of their vehicle exposed, trying to deal with whatever had failed. Beyond the bend in the road, her sensors told her what was there before the men on the ground could have known it. She could see it, she could act on it. She had the ordnance, and she had the position, and she had the angle. She thought about the order she had just received. She thought about the absolute clarity of its language. She thought about what would happen to her career, her record, everything she had built over 8 years if she violated a direct order from Mission Command. And she banked away. Warren did not. She heard his radio call, brief, calm, professional, declaring his intention to remain on station. And then she was past the ridge line and the valley was behind her, and she was flying back to base with her hands on the controls and Warren Holt's voice going quiet in her headset. The after-action report said he was shot down during an unsanctioned engagement. The report was accurate. The report did not say that he had seen the same thing Nora had seen. The report did not say that he had made the choice she had chosen not to make. The report said nothing about what it had cost her to make that choice or how the cost had grown every year since, in the way that unpaid things grow. She had written her portion of that report carefully, precisely, and without a single false statement. She had reported her actions, her compliance with the order to break off, and had offered nothing beyond what was directly asked. Then she had gone back to her quarters and sat on the edge of her bunk for a long time. She had been told by people who wanted to be kind that she had done the right thing, that following orders in conditions of uncertainty was the correct behavior, the professional behavior, the behavior that allowed military institutions to function. She listened to all of this. She did not argue with any of it. And she understood, in the way you understand things that do not require argument, that the people telling her these things were not wrong exactly, and that none of it changed what she knew about the moment she had made her decision. She had flown for 14 more months after Kunar Valley. 14 months of missions completed with the same precision that had always characterized her work. Nobody who watched her fly would have known anything had changed. But the cockpit had become a different place. The seat she had once settled into with a sense of rightness had become a place where a question lived, a question she could not answer, could not silence, could not fly around. What will you do when it matters most? When she walked into that office in Virginia and told the colonel she was done, she had not tried to explain this. She would not have known how to explain it to someone who had not been there. She had simply said she was finished and handed in her paperwork and found other work and tried to build a life in which the question did not follow her. She had not entirely succeeded at that last part. The runway stretched ahead of tail 707 as Nora pushed the throttles forward, the aircraft accelerating with the heavy, purposeful surge of something not built for speed, but built to mean it when it moved. The desert fell away beneath her. The base shrank in her peripheral vision. The sky ahead was the deep blue of late afternoon at elevation, the kind of blue that looks peaceful until you understand what you're flying into. 6 minutes now to the pass, 6 minutes until she would be in the canyon where the convoy was moving, and 12,000 people were going about their Tuesday evening without knowing any of this existed. On the open channel, she heard Garrett Tulloch's voice from the ridge. If she's really Shadow 7, he did not finish the sentence. She understood he was not talking to her. The desert was flat and fast beneath her. She kept the climb shallow, trading altitude for speed and position, keeping the aircraft where it was most dangerous. Low slow by fighter standards, moving through the last light with its weapons live and its systems reaching forward into the terrain ahead. She had told herself for 11 years that she was done with this. The canyon entrance appeared ahead, a dark gap in the ridgeline, the late sun catching the upper walls and leaving the floor in shadow. Inside it, something was moving towards something that could not be allowed to reach it. She brought the nose to the canyon entrance. Shadow 7 is inbound, she said into the radio. Her voice was level, professional, the voice of someone who has made the decision that needed making. Devil's Backbone ingress, weapons hot. The walls of the canyon rose up and took her in. The canyon swallowed her whole. One moment there was open sky and the last red light of the afternoon spreading flat across the desert. The next, the walls were on both sides and the floor was 40 feet below, and the sound of the engines became something different, no longer the open-throated roar of an aircraft in free air, but a compressed, bouncing thing that came back off the rock and made it feel like the aircraft was surrounded, enclosed, committed. Because it was. Devil's Backbone Pass ran roughly northwest to southeast for 11 miles before opening into the approach terrain above Blue Mesa Dam. In those 11 miles, the canyon narrowed in 3 places, turned hard twice, and dropped 200 feet in elevation. The walls ranged from 300 to 800 feet on either side. In the lower section, they leaned slightly inward, as if the rock had been arguing with itself for centuries about how much space to allow. Nora had the terrain mapped in her head, not as an abstract set of measurements, but as a physical space with specific character, specific hazards, specific places where a pilot's options narrowed, and places where they briefly opened. She had studied it from satellite imagery and topographic charts at a desk in the maintenance building 4 years ago for no operational reason she could have named at the time, out of a habit she had never broken. That habit was keeping her alive right now. The pod camera on the aircraft's center line lit up with heat signatures ahead, faint at first, blurred by distance and the thermal noise of sun-baked rock releasing its heat into the cooling air. Then brighter, then distinct. 6 vehicles, 2 columns staggered, moving in tight formation. The spacing of each vehicle was deliberate, positioned to cover the angles of the ones beside it, nothing wasted, nothing exposed beyond what was necessary. At the center of the formation, squatting lower than the carriers around them, were the 2 jamming trucks. She could see their antenna arrays rotating slowly, those long whips cutting arcs in the air above the convoy. They were the brain of the entire operation. Everything that made this convoy dangerous lived in those 2 vehicles. She armed the first Maverick. The acquisition tone in her headset was flat and patient, the electronic patience of a system that would wait as long as necessary for the geometry to be right. The targeting cursor slid over the lead jamming truck, and the tone changed, climbing and pitch tightening. "Good luck," she fired. The missile came off the rail with a thump felt in the seat and the stick and the soles of her feet, leaving a thin white smoke trail that bent low then straightened as it found its path and committed to it. It covered the distance in less time than it takes to draw a full breath. The lead jamming truck ceased to exist. The explosion filled the canyon ahead with light and pressure, the overpressure wave bouncing off the walls and arriving at the aircraft as a flat, hard slap against the canopy. Through the rolling smoke and debris, she could see the convoy reacting vehicles, swerving gaps appearing in the formation, the tight geometric logic of the thing dissolving at its center. She pushed the nose down. The GAU-8 Avenger is not a weapon that announces itself subtly. 7 barrels spinning at 4,000 revolutions per minute, firing at a rate that makes individual shots indistinguishable from each other, producing a sound that has been described by people who have experienced it from the wrong end as the sound of the sky tearing. At the distances involved in canyon work, the sound arrives almost simultaneously with the rounds. You hear it, and you are already hit. The first armored carrier she engaged had been trying to reverse out of the gap left by the destroyed jammer truck. Its driver was attempting something reasonable given the circumstances: create distance, find cover, reorient. He had perhaps 2 seconds before the pipper settled on his vehicle's flank and Nora squeezed the trigger. The rounds hit with the specific finality of something that has been aimed carefully. The carrier stopped moving in the way that objects stop moving when the mechanisms that animated them no longer exist. She pulled up before she ran out of floor. Garrett Tulloch's voice came through with new information, urgent but controlled, the voice of someone who had processed something and understood it mattered. Shadow 7 SEAL Recon. Be advised, we are observing convoy defensive formation pattern Delta 7. I say again, Delta 7. Do you copy? Nora banked hard, left bleeding speed to set up for the next engagement. Copy? Where'd you pull Delta 7 from? A beat. Present but brief. It's from a close air support countermeasures training document, 74th Fighter Squadron, 2013. Classification was lifted 2 years ago. The document describes exactly how a ground convoy should reposition and cover angles when an A-10 is engaging at low altitude in confined terrain. He paused. The document was authored by you. The canyon walls moved past on both sides. Nora noted this and moved forward. Whoever had planned this convoy operation had done specific homework. They had studied how she thought, how she would approach a target in this terrain, how she would come at a formation that needed breaking. They had built their defenses around her specific methods. They had expected her. She filed it and focused on what was in front of her. The second jamming truck was moving. Its driver had watched the first truck disappear and drawn the correct, immediate conclusion. Staying in the center of the formation made him the most important target. He was pushing his vehicle toward the right wall of the canyon, using the angle of the rock to reduce the arcs from which the aircraft could engage him. 2 escort vehicles were repositioning to cover him, their anti-air systems swinging to track the sky. Smart, organized, adapting. She went lower. 150 feet above the canyon floor. 100. The radar altimeter ticked down with the flat patience of a system reporting facts and leaving the judgment to someone else. Below 100 feet, the walls felt less like geography and more like presence, the ancient, indifferent presence of something that had been here before everything and would be here after. The updrafts from the sun-baked rock tried to get under her wings, and she trimmed against them, feeling each correction come back through the stick as a small argument won. The jammer truck was in her pod, now moving, but predictable. It had only so many directions available given the canyon geometry, and Nora had already calculated which direction it would choose before it chose. She watched it choose correctly, which in this case meant moving exactly where she expected. She armed the second Maverick. The missile found its lock. She was about to fire when the warning system screamed. A shoulder-fired missile had come off the right wall from a team she had not located. The launch signature was brief and hot, and then the missile was in the air, chasing the heat of her engines, and she was already responding hard. Left rudder and stick together trading altitude she did not have for the angle she needed, flares cascading behind her as she rolled. The missile tracked left with her for a half second, then found the flares and made the wrong choice. The explosion was close enough to jolt the aircraft. The threat warning panel came back quieter, but not silent. She had the attention of the escort vehicles now. Tracer rounds stitched bright arcs across the canyon air, working angles they thought she had to fly through. They were right about the angles. They were not quite right about the timing. She cut across the canyon floor in a move that traded every margin she had for 1 second of geometry, a second in which she was below the tracer fire and behind the line the gunners had committed to, and she came up on the far side of that second with the jammer truck filling her pod and the tone climbing back to its settled certainty. She fired. The second Maverick hit the truck in its rear quarter. The explosion lifted the vehicle briefly, as if it weighed nothing, then dropped it on its side in a fireball that painted the canyon walls orange and black. The antenna arrays that had been rotating moments ago were now pieces of metal distributed across 100 meters of canyon floor. The jamming was gone. She felt it in the electronic environment before she could confirm it, a sudden openness in her systems, a clearing as if a noise she had grown used to had simply stopped. Her radar warning receiver settled. Her targeting systems responded cleanly. The sky above the canyon, closed to every other asset for the past 17 minutes, was open again. Garrett's voice came through without static now. Something had shifted in it as well, the same professional precision as before, but with an undertone that had not been there earlier. As if completing the tactical phase of the engagement had freed some part of his attention for what came next. Shadow 7 SEAL Recon. Both jammers are down. You're clear to finish it. She was already banking into the engagement. The convoy had lost its electronic shield, and it knew it. The remaining vehicles were pushing forward, still trying for the dam, still trying to complete the mission, but the formation discipline was breaking down. Gaps had appeared. Individual vehicles were making individual choices. The organism that Tulloch had described earlier, every element covering the others, was coming apart into its components. The GAU-8 came alive again. She worked the formation methodically, prioritizing the vehicles most likely to complete independent action, then the ones trying to regroup, then the ones that had lost their purpose and were simply trying to survive. The sound of the cannon in the confined canyon was enormous, a physical force that bounced back hard enough to rattle loose items in the cockpit. She kept her head still, her eyes on the pod, her hands steady on the controls. The last two carriers from the lead element broke hard and pushed forward simultaneously, a coordinated attempt to punch through before she could turn. She rolled into the climbing bank she needed and locked the first one with her last Maverick, and felt the jet shudder as the missile left the rail. Fire ahead in the canyon, one carrier gone. The second one was fast and determined and almost made it. Almost. She brought the nose down and the Pipper found the vehicle's rear deck, and the GAU-8 fired, and the carrier's ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion that reached halfway up the canyon walls. She pulled up from the last pass. The convoy floor below her was still. The smoke was thick and slow-moving in the canyon air, and through it, she could see the scattered wreckage of what had been a disciplined, capable, well-equipped operation 90 seconds ago. The anti-air vehicles were silent. The carriers were burning. Nothing was moving with purpose. She had done what she had come to do. She leveled the aircraft and began a gentle banking turn to survey the canyon floor. And then the second jammer truck hit her. Not the truck she had destroyed, a third vehicle, smaller, unmarked, positioned in a depression behind a rock formation on the western wall, a position that had been invisible to her pod until this moment, because it had been designed to be invisible, because whoever placed it had understood her attack geometry before she flew it and had positioned a backup asset specifically in the dead zone of her approach. Her third jamming truck had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment after the main engagement when attention shifts and systems reset and a pilot's awareness, however disciplined, has processed the immediate threat as neutralized. She registered the new electronic signature a fraction of a second before its effect hit her systems. Then the interference came back partial, but real, degrading her targeting and choking her communications channel into static. Not as powerful as the first two, but enough. Garrett's voice fragmented in her headset. The remaining escort vehicles, which had been in disarray, began to reorient with new purpose. She understood what was happening. The third truck had not been part of the convoy's operational package. It had been positioned as a recovery asset, not to protect the convoy, but to neutralize the aircraft that stopped the convoy. To close the sky again after the main jammers were destroyed. To ensure that whatever came through the pass to stop them could be stopped in turn. They had planned for her specifically. They had planned for her to succeed and had prepared for that contingency. She went after the third truck with everything she had left, which at this point was the GAU-8, and her own judgment and the specific accumulated knowledge of what this aircraft could do in confined terrain when its pilot had made up her mind. She found the vehicle in its depression, confirmed the geometry, and fired in a burst that was economic and exact. The third truck went the way the first two had gone, and the electronic environment cleared for the second time, and this time stayed clear. But the escort vehicles had used the window to reposition. Two of them had moved to the canyon walls, and their crews were on the slopes now, with shoulder-fired systems elevation giving them angles they had not had before. Tracer fire came in from two directions simultaneously. She rolled and dispensed flares, and the first missile went wide, but the second one clipped her left engine intake with its exhaust as it passed. She felt it as a sharp impact and heard a new roughness enter the engine sound, not failure, but a warning. The oil pressure gauge stepped down. The left engine warning light came on red. She dispatched the remaining escort vehicles in two more passes, working with the precise economy of someone who understands that her operational margin is now measured in minutes rather than fuel, who makes no move that does not directly serve the objective of surviving this canyon and reaching the runway that is 50 miles away. When the last vehicle on the canyon floor had stopped moving and the anti-air teams on the slopes had been silenced, she leveled out and checked her gauges. Left engine oil pressure, critical band. Starboard hydraulic pressure, declining. She had taken a hit during the engagement, and the aircraft had absorbed it. This was what the A-10 had been built to do, but absorbing something is not the same as being unaffected by it. She was losing systems. The question was how fast. Garrett came back on. The channel was clear now, and his voice carried something new in it, urgency. But underneath the urgency, the particular quality of a man who has been waiting to say something and has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is as close to the right moment as he is going to get. Shadow 7 SEAL Recon, convoy neutralized. Be advised we are observing smoke from your fuselage left side. Confirmed damage status. Confirmed left engine oil pressure critical. Starboard hydraulics declining. Still flying. Base is recommending immediate climb to egress route Charlie. She looked at the canyon walls. Charlie route would take her up and over the ridge to the north, adding 4 minutes to her flight home and requiring a sustained climb that would make serious demands of a left engine already in trouble. Negative on Charlie. Too much altitude gain required with current engine status. A pause. What's your play or river cut? Shorter by 3 minutes. I stay low. The river cut was a secondary drainage that intersected Devil's Backbone approximately 2 miles ahead and ran northwest, opening into the flat desert about 7 miles from Holloway. It was narrower than the pass, considerably narrower. It had never appeared in any mission planning document she had seen because nobody flying a current generation combat aircraft would seriously consider it as a flight path. The A-10 was not a current generation combat aircraft. River cut is barely wide enough, Garrett said, not arguing, reporting. I know. You've flown it once in simulation. She did not add that the simulation had been 11 years ago on software no longer in service. Some information was not useful to share. Your call, Shadow 7. She was already turning toward the intersection. The river cut did not look dangerous from the entrance. That was one of its dangers. The initial opening was broad enough to suggest the rest might be manageable. The walls were lower at the entrance, the floor relatively flat. A pilot entering for the first time might have a moment of thinking the reputation of this terrain had been somewhat exaggerated. That moment ended approximately 400 meters in. The walls stepped inward sharply in the way that geology sometimes changes without apparent warning. The strip of sky above narrowed. The floor dropped. The crosswinds that had been a minor consideration at the entrance became a structural feature of the experience, gusts rolling off the sun-warmed walls and slamming down into the cut at angles that wanted to roll the aircraft at moments chosen entirely by the terrain. She flew it with the stick and rudder in constant motion, small corrections layering on top of each other, never letting any single input complete itself before the next one was needed. The aircraft's response was sluggish. In the roll axis, the starboard hydraulics were continuing to degrade, and she could feel the difference in the weight of the controls. Her pod camera was still active. She kept it scanning ahead, reading the cut's turns before she was in them, buying seconds of reaction time with information. The first threat signature appeared at the third bend. A heat source low against the right wall, positioned where the canyon floor widened by about 20 feet before narrowing again exactly where a man with a shoulder-fired missile would set up if he knew a specific aircraft was coming through a specific space at a specific time. The position had been chosen because the geometry of the bend forced any approaching aircraft to slow slightly and adjust heading, creating a brief predictable window. She saw it before she was in the window. She pulled the throttle back bleeding speed, not because she had been caught unprepared, but because making herself look slowed down and predictable was the most useful thing she could do in the next 4 seconds. The heat signature shifted as the man on the wall tracked her. The missile launch came exactly when she expected it. She rolled hard right, full flares, and the missile chose the brightest heat source behind her and followed it into the canyon wall. She used the roll to bring her nose briefly onto the man's position. A short burst. The GAU-8 in controlled fire spoke once. The position on the right wall ceased to be a concern. She rolled back and picked up her heading. Further in, the cut widened briefly into a small basin before the final narrow section that led out to the open desert. 300 meters across at its widest, a flat space in a place of no flat spaces. There was a truck in it, flatbed, heavy, the tarp pulled back. A twin-barrel autocannon on a pintle mount crew of 3, positioned in the center of the basin with clear fields of fire covering the entire width of the cut in both directions. An ambush, built and waiting. Not a reaction to her presence. Pre-positioned. Someone had known she would come through here. Someone who understood how she would calculate the exit geometry of a damaged aircraft needing the shortest path home. She had less than 2 seconds between seeing it and being inside its engagement envelope. The pipper went to the truck and her thumb went to the trigger, and the GAU-8 fired in a burst that converted the truck and the crew around it and the autocannon mounted on it from a threat into wreckage before any of them had fully registered that the aircraft had appeared in the basin. The aircraft flew through the debris cloud. A chunk of something hit the left engine intake. She felt it a hard impact and heard the engine's roughness step up a level. Then the harness bit into her left shoulder as she corrected the yaw that followed a sharp, specific pain she registered and filed. The oil pressure gauge stepped down another increment. She was out of missiles. The GAU-8 drum had enough rounds for one more engagement if needed. The hydraulic system's warning light had moved from amber to red while she was dealing with the autocannon. The roll response had gotten heavier. The end of the cut was visible ahead. 200 meters, the walls beginning to fall away. The desert opening. And there, positioned at the mouth of the cut where any exiting aircraft had to gain brief altitude before leveling off, position exactly where a pilot would be most exposed and least able to maneuver, was a vehicle-mounted missile launcher. Its radar was active, its crew was tracking her. The tone that came into her headset was the harder, more insistent tone of something that had already found her and was not going to lose her. She had perhaps 3 seconds before it fired. Nora looked at the geometry. Turning back was not possible. Going over the top of the walls required a climb the left engine would not support. The mouth of the cut was closed by a system already tracking her. She cut the throttle back to near idle. The aircraft slowed dramatically and suddenly in a way no rational pilot would do in front of an active missile system. The tracking radar saw what it expected: an aircraft whose energy state had changed, whose projected flight path was now different from the one it had been computing. In the 2 seconds while the system's algorithm updated its model, she dropped the nose hard and used the remaining hydraulic authority to bring the aircraft to an attitude that was barely controlled flight, but was aimed directly at the launcher. She opened the throttle and held the trigger. The GAU-8 fired. The launcher fired. Her flares went out simultaneously. The missile climbed away toward the flares and the wall above the cut where her flight path no longer was. The rounds from the cannon covered the distance to the launcher in less time than the thought of what could have happened had time to form. The mouth of the cut cleared. The desert opened in front of her like a held breath releasing. The sky went from a narrow strip to everything from confinement to space, and the aircraft flew out of the canyon into the open air of the Nevada evening, with its left engine rougher than it should be, and its hydraulic systems continuing their slow departure from acceptable, and its pilot's hands exactly steady on the controls. Holloway Air Force Base was a faint geometry of lights on the horizon, 7 miles. She had enough aircraft to cover 7 miles, probably. The left engine warning panel added a new light. Oil pressure had reached the critical band, the range where the instrument stops reporting degrees of acceptable and begins reporting degrees of how long. She ran the arithmetic. The aircraft might hold together for 7 miles. The engine might continue to function adequately for the time that 7 miles at current airspeed required. Might. Garrett Tulloch came back on the net. Shadow 7 convoy is fully neutralized. All threat signatures are cold. Dam perimeter is secure. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The tactical economy that had characterized every exchange in the past 40 minutes was still present. But something had been added to it, something that had weight and had been carried carefully and was now being set down. The town is safe. 12,000 people are going to finish their Tuesday evening without knowing any of this happened. Nora looked at the horizon, at the lights that were Holloway in the distance. Copy SEAL Recon. Good work on the ground. Shadow 7, a beat that carried intention. There's something I need to tell you. Not a tactical update. Something else. He stopped. Started again with the directness of a man who has spent time choosing his words and has decided that directness is more honest than preparation. My name is Garrett Tulloch. Warren Holt was my father. He took a different name when my mother remarried. That's why the names don't match. But he was First Lieutenant Warren Holt, 74th Fighter Squadron, Cunard Valley, 11 years ago. The desert moved beneath her. I've known your name for a long time. I knew you might be here today. I didn't know for certain until I heard the channel traffic and heard them say Shadow 7. And I need you to know who's on the ground down here, because what I'm about to ask you to do. He stopped. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just needed you to know. The left engine made a sound she had not heard from it before. She made a small adjustment to the throttle and it settled. 7 miles. She said nothing for a long time. Long enough that Garrett might have thought the channel had dropped. Then, I knew Warren Holt. I know you did. I'll tell you about it when I'm on the ground. Copy that, Shadow 7. A pause that was not tactical, but human. Come home. She set her heading for Holloway and did not look back at the canyon. The desert at dusk has a particular quality of light that pilots learn to read the way sailors read water. It is not the golden light of midday or the hard white light of afternoon. It is something softer and more deceptive, a low amber that flattens depth and makes distances uncertain, that turns familiar terrain into something that looks almost right, but requires confirmation. Flying into it, you learn not to trust what you see without also trusting what your instruments tell you. Nora trusted her instruments. They were telling her a story she did not particularly enjoy. The left engine had settled into a functional rhythm that was rough in the way, suggesting it was operating more on determination than engineering. The oil pressure was in the red band and holding there the way things hold when they are near the end of what they can sustain, not failing yet, but making clear that failing was a decision under active consideration. The starboard hydraulic pressure had dropped to a level that made the roll response feel like arguing with someone increasingly uninterested in the conversation. She had 5 miles left. She worked through the arithmetic of what 5 miles required with the same methodical focus she had brought to every other calculation in the past 40 minutes. Not hoping, not fearing, identifying what was true and what the truth required. Landing gear was not an option. The hydraulic pressure remaining was sufficient to extend the gear, but insufficient to lock it reliably. And an unlocked gear on touchdown was a worse problem than no gear at all. It would catch unevenly, dig into the tarmac, and the asymmetric loading would put the aircraft into a rotation that she would have neither the speed nor the control authority to correct. Sideways at 180 knots in a damaged aircraft was a category of experience she was not interested in adding to her record. Belly landing, straight in, full length of the runway foam laid down, emergency cruise positioned. The math was survivable, not comfortable, not simple. Survivable provided the left engine kept its current commitment for another 4 minutes, and provided the hydraulics did not make any sudden decisions in the final approach, and provided she flew the last half mile with enough precision that the belly contacted the foam at an angle and a speed the airframe could absorb. 3 provisos, none of them certain. She had landed on worse odds. Vance came on the command channel. His voice had the particular texture it had carried throughout the afternoon, authoritative and measured, a voice built by decades of command into something that conveyed priority without waste. But beneath that texture now, she heard something adjacent to concern. Callaway. Telemetry shows left engine oil pressure at 7%. Starboard hydraulics at 14. You are losing both systems. I need you to hear me clearly. I'm listening, sir. There is a viable ejection corridor directly above your current position. Wind is favorable. Recovery team is pre-positioned 6 miles northeast. You eject now, you're on the ground in 8 minutes. Aircraft goes down in the empty desert. Nobody gets hurt. She looked at the instruments. Then she looked out the canopy at the amber light and the flat desert and the distant geometry of Holloway on the horizon close enough now that she could make out individual structures, the hangars, the tower, the long pale line of the main runway. She looked at her hands on the controls. These same hands had been on controls in a different canyon in a different country 11 years ago. They had made a choice in the seconds between seeing something and being past the ridge line, and she had been living inside that choice ever since. Not a wrong choice by the measures the institution used, just the choice she had made with the calculations she had run and the weight she had given each factor in the moment. She had given the wrong weight to the wrong factor. She had known that since the day she made it, not as a source of ongoing anguish, but as a permanent feature of the interior landscape, simply there, simply true, requiring daily navigation. She had left Warren Holt behind. She had followed the order and banked away and left him to make a different choice than hers, and he had made it, and it had cost him everything. She was not leaving this aircraft behind, not in the empty desert. Not anywhere that was not the base complete landed, brought home the way you bring something home when you made a promise to it and to yourself about what that meant. Negative on ejection, she said, not loudly, not with drama, with the flatness of a decision already made. A pause. Callaway. With respect, sir, I'm not getting out of this aircraft over the desert. I'm bringing her in. She heard the firmness in her own voice and recognized it, not stubbornness, but something quieter and more settled. Certainty. The specific certainty of a decision made at a level deeper than the moment of making it. I need the runway foamed full length. I need fire crews on both ends, and I need a clear channel because I'm going to be busy in the last 30 seconds. The pause this time was longer. She could hear Sterling Vance running the same arithmetic she had already run. He was a pilot. He had been a pilot before he had been a commander, and the pilot in him would read the numbers the same way she had and arrive at the same uncomfortable place, survivable, but requiring everything. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted by something small but definite. Runway is being foamed now. Emergency crews are hot on both ends. A breath. Don't waste it. No, sir. She began her descent. The last 5 miles were the most demanding flying she had ever done. Not because the aircraft was failing, it was failing clearly and progressively, but slowly enough to be managed. Not because the approach was technically complicated. They were the most demanding 5 miles because of what they required her to hold simultaneously. In one hand, the physical management of an aircraft with degrading systems, calculating in real time how each further loss of hydraulic pressure changed the responsiveness of the controls, compensating for the asymmetric thrust from an engine no longer delivering cleanly, keeping the aircraft on a glide path steep enough to make the runway, but shallow enough that the sink rate on contact would not break what needed to survive. In the other hand, everything else. The weight of what Garrett had told her, Warren Holt's son standing in a canyon in Colorado, looking up at her aircraft, trusting her the way his father had trusted her. The weight of 11 years lived in the margins of a place she had not allowed herself to fully occupy. She held all of it. AWACS came back on the channel clear, now the voice of the controller calm and giving her exactly the information she needed and nothing else. Shadow 7 winds from 210 at 11 knots. You will need to crab slightly right on final to track centerline. Current sink rate manageable, but will need correction at the 1 mile point. Foam coverage confirmed full length. Copy. Shadow 7 be advised, left engine telemetry shows increased combustion irregularity in the last 90 seconds. She already felt it. Small lurches in the thrust delivery, brief and irregular, the engine catching itself each time, but with decreasing confidence. A man walking on a bad knee, managing but each step a negotiation. 3 miles. She made the first throttle adjustment, backing off the left engine slightly to reduce stress on it, accepting the slight yaw that came with asymmetric thrust and correcting it with rudder. The aircraft responded, not cleanly, not with the crispness she had known from this airframe, but it responded, which was what mattered. 2 miles. The runway was visible now without instruments. She could see the foam white against gray tarmac in the fading light. a long, pale carpet laid down by people doing their job carefully and trusting her to do hers. She could see the lights of the fire trucks along both sides of the runway, their emergency lights turning slowly patient and ready. She could see figures behind the barriers, more than she expected. The ground crews, the crew chiefs, the pilots, she had expected those. But others as well. People with no operational reason to be on the flight line who had come because they had heard the channel traffic and understood what was happening and could not make themselves stay away. She understood the specific quality of attention. A crowd like that had the held breath quality of people watching something that has not yet resolved. She did not perform for them. She flew. 1 mile. The left engine made a sound different from all the sounds it had been making. Not failure, not yet, but a deepening of the roughness, a change in register telling her the combustion irregularity had stepped up. She looked at the gauge. Oil pressure had moved past the point that most checklists described as operational limit and into the range described in language that did not leave room for interpretation. She cut the left engine. The thrust disappeared from the left side and the aircraft yawed, and she caught it with right rudder and held it, feeling the pedal pressure required and providing it the airframe now gliding on one engine. The geometry of her approach steepened with the loss of power. She adjusted the right engine's throttle, rough but functional, still giving what she asked, and reestablished the glide path. The speed was decreasing. Too slow, and the controls would become suggestions rather than commands. She needed to arrive at the runway with enough speed that the aircraft still responded, that the initial contact was controlled and directed and not simply a falling. 1/2 mile. She could read individual numbers on the runway markings. She could see the foam piled at the threshold, white and dense. She cut the right engine, both engines off. The aircraft was a glider now. A very heavy, marginally controllable glider, with damaged hydraulics and no thrust reserve, and one chance to get the next 30 seconds exactly right. The sound changed completely. The engine noise that had been the constant background of the past hour went away, and what replaced it was the sound of wind over the airframe. The fundamental sound of a large metal object moving through air by momentum alone, and beneath that sound faintly the creak and tick of structure under load. She flew it with her hands and feet. The controls were heavier than they had been, the hydraulic system, providing assistance the way a person with a failing arm provides assistance with a heavy weight, doing what it could with what remained. She could feel every aerodynamic input in her forearms, the load transferring directly into her grip. She held the aircraft on the center line. 200 feet, 150. The foam was underneath her now, the runway rushing from distance into immediacy in the way it always did in the final seconds, the rate of change going from perceptible to startling to arrival. 80 feet. She pulled the nose up slightly, checking the sink rate. Not stalling, just reducing the vertical component, buying the fraction of a second that made the difference between a landing and a collision with the ground. 50 feet. The belly of the aircraft touched the foam. The sound was not like anything else. Not the controlled, sequential sounds of a normal landing. A single continuous roar of metal on tarmac, the aircraft's armored underside cutting through the foam and finding the runway surface beneath it, and beginning the long, loud, grinding argument between momentum and friction that would end when one of them ran out. Sparks went out in twin trails behind her. The aircraft pulled left, and she held right rudder, and the nose came back, and she held it, and the aircraft tracked mostly straight in the way that damaged things track when handled firmly, not with elegance, but with insistence. The deceleration was violent and distributed, transmitted through the seat and the harness and the structure of the airframe in waves that were not comfortable but were survivable. She kept her hands on the controls, not because the controls were doing much anymore, but because keeping them there was part of the promise she had made. The speed bled off in increments that felt like years. Then it was over. Tail 707 came to rest approximately 800 meters from the threshold, slightly left of centerline smoke rising from the belly where the metal had been in sustained contact with the tarmac and was now cooling into silence. Nora sat in the cockpit. She did not move immediately. She let the hands that had been holding things for the past hour rest against controls that no longer required holding, and she looked at the panel-dead instruments, hydraulic pressure, zeroed fuel counter, at the number it showed when the tanks were running on memory, and she let the fact of stillness become real before she acted on it. The canopy release was where it had always been. She activated it, and the seal broke, and the cool evening air came in smelling of foam and hot metal, and the sharp smell of brakes and friction, in the desert underneath all of it. She breathed it. Then she unstrapped. The harness buckles opened in sequence, the same sequence they had always opened in. She stood in the seat and put her boots on the wing, and looked out at the runway at the foam still hissing where it touched the cooling metal, at the fire trucks already moving toward her position, at the figures coming through the barriers and across the tarmac. She dropped from the wing to the runway. The foam was cold under her boots and the tarmac was solid and real, and she stood on it and turned and put her hand against the belly of the aircraft, against the metal that had taken the runway's full argument and was still in one piece, and she held it there. The metal was warm under her palm, the stored heat of friction still dissipating slowly into the air. The scar from Kunar Valley was somewhere above her on the nose she could not see from this angle, but she knew it was there. It had always been there. "I told you," she said, quiet enough that the approaching crews could not hear. "I told you I'd bring you back." She took her hand away and turned to face what was coming. Sterling Vance was walking toward her with the pace of a man who has been waiting at a measured distance for the right moment and has decided the right moment is now. He was in his late 50s, lean, his face carrying the specific weathering of a career spent partly indoors, making decisions, and partly outdoors living with them. He stopped 6 feet from her. Behind him, ground crews were beginning the work of assessing the aircraft, moving carefully with lights and checklists. The medics hovered at the edge of Nora's peripheral vision with their kits open and their professional attention directed at her in the way medical professionals direct attention at people they are not yet sure are as fine as they appear. She waved them off with one hand. Vance looked at her for a moment without speaking, the look of a man who had prepared something to say and was now reconsidering whether what he had prepared was actually the right thing. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said, not loudly, not harshly. "The way you state a fact that both parties are aware of and that exists in the conversation, because ignoring it would be its own kind of dishonesty." "I brought the aircraft home, sir." "You brought the aircraft home." He let that sit. "You also neutralized a convoy that our current generation assets could not touch, saved a dam, and kept 12,000 people from finding out tonight that the world can end without warning on a Tuesday." She said nothing. "You also," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, "demonstrated that everything on record about your capabilities was accurate. That does not happen by accident or by luck. That happens because of who you are and what you have not stopped being, regardless of what your file said for the past 11 years. He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and produced a folder. A few pages folded with a cover sheet she could not read at this distance in the failing light. "This morning," and he said, "when the threat intelligence came in and I saw the canyon coordinates, I pulled your file. I have looked at that file more times than I can count in 4 years and never had cause to act on what I found in it. Today I had cause." He held the folder at his side, not yet offering it. "I printed what's in here before I knew whether you would step forward. I printed it because if this situation was going to call anyone, it was going to call you. I wanted to be ready." She looked at the folder. "What's in it?" she asked. He held it out. She took it. She opened it on the runway in the fading light with the foam cooling under tail 7. 07 and the last amber deepening toward purple in the western sky. The first page was a single document on Air Force letterhead. Flight status restoration. Her name, her service number, her qualifications current to the date of her last verified flight, with a note in Vance's handwriting indicating a 48-hour qualification check would be required before independent operations. A signature line at the bottom where Vance had already signed. A line below it where she would sign if she chose to. The second page was a training authorization form. Unremarkable. The third page was not on Air Force letterhead. It was a single sheet of plain paper, the kind that came from a ruled notebook. The handwriting was small and slanted, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly without pressing hard, the letters distinct but connected with efficiency rather than elegance. At the top of the page in the same hand were 2 words, "For Garrett." She read it. She read it standing on the runway with the light failing and the medics watching from a distance, and Sterling Vance standing 6 feet away, and she did not rush. Warren Holt had written the letter before the Kunar Valley mission. She could tell from the absence of operational specifics he had known something significant was planned for the following morning without writing what it was, which was how men wrote before missions. They were uncertain about in ways they could not fully explain. He had written about his son with the directness of a father who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and has concluded that ornament gets in the way of meaning. Most of the letter was between a father and his son, and she moved through it with the respect owed to things that were not written for her. Near the end, there was a paragraph with her name in it. Warren had written that if anything happened to him, and if Garrett ever found himself in a situation that was too large for what he knew, he should find Nora Calloway. Not because she was infallible, not because she had always done the right thing, he had written that explicitly without bitterness, as a statement of fact about a complicated person in a complicated world, but because she was the kind of person who learned what her mistakes cost and paid the full amount and came out the other side of the paying still standing. He had written, "She'll know what to do even when she doesn't believe she does. She always has. Trust her the way I trusted her, which is all the way even when it was hard." He had written, "She's going to carry Kunar for a long time. If she's still carrying it when you find her, tell her I said to put it down. She's earned the right." The letter ended without a formal closing. He had not finished it, or he had finished it in a way that said what it needed to say without conclusion. He had folded it and left it somewhere, and Garrett had found it, and Garrett had kept it for 11 years, and at some point it had passed into Sterling Vance's hands, and now it was in hers. She folded it along its original creases. She held it for a moment without looking at Vance. Then she put it in the chest pocket of her flight suit against the fabric where it would stay warm. "I'll sign the flight status form," she said. Vance nodded, exactly once. The nod of a man who has been waiting for something a long time and has received it and is not going to make more of the moment than it requires. "There's one more thing," he said. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided that what he is about to say is owed and has been owed for some time. 11 years ago, I was not in this command. I was at Langley Advisory Role, and I had access to after-action material from Kunar Valley that most people at your level would not have seen. I read the full report, not the summary, the full report, including the sensor logs and the mission controller's communication record. He held her eyes. "I know what you saw in the valley before you banked away. I know exactly what those seconds contained, and I know what Warren Holt saw when he made his decision." She waited. "When I took this command, I pulled your file. Your status showed inactive reserve. Your credentials were still in the system, technically valid, never formally closed. That is not an accident, Nora." He had not used her given name before this moment. "I kept you in the system, not on active status, not in any way that would have created a record. Just present, just available. Because I read that report and I understood something about you that the official record did not capture, and I decided to wait." She thought about 4 years of faded coveralls and maintenance checklists and Hangar 3. "You kept my file open for 11 years, she said. "Yes, and I kept it open here in this command for 4 years, because I knew that if something came along that required exactly what you are capable of, I wanted you close enough to answer." She looked at him for a moment, at the weathered face and the steady eyes and the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down. She did not say thank you. It was not that kind of moment. She reached into the folder and took out the flight status form and found the pen in the breast pocket of her flight suit and signed it against the folder. She handed it back to him. He took it without ceremony, folded it once, and put it in his jacket. "Welcome back, Shadow 7, he said. She turned toward the maintenance shelter where Tail 707 had been towed. Garrett Tulloch found her at the entrance to the shelter. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent considerable time moving through spaces where noise was a liability, and he arrived beside her without announcement, simply present where he had not been a moment before. He was younger looking in person than she had constructed from his voice. Early 30s. His face had the quality of someone who had been outdoors for most of his adult life, the lines around his eyes more prominent than his age strictly required. He was not in uniform, generic civilian clothing, the clothes of a man who had been in the field and had not yet had reason to change. His eyes were his father's. She had known Warren Holt's eyes well. She had spent 14 months flying beside the man who had them. Garrett looked at her for a moment without speaking. She did not fill the silence. The silences people need to cross are their own to cross, and filling them is rarely a kindness. "The dam held," he said. It held. He looked at the aircraft in the shelter behind her. The crew had begun their damage assessment, moving carefully around the airframe, with lights and checklists cataloging what had been taken and what had survived. There was a great deal to catalog in both categories. "My father used to talk about this aircraft," he said, not with sentiment, with the directness of someone reporting something true. Not specifically this tail number, but the A-10. He said it was the only aircraft he had ever been in that felt like it was designed by someone who understood that the person inside it was going to need help. He was right about that. Garrett looked at her. In the set of his face was something that had been composed throughout the afternoon and was now, with the mission complete and the immediacy of it fully past, no longer needing to be composed in the same way. He was the son of a man she had known standing across from the full weight of what the day had contained, and the space between them held things that were real and complicated and not resolvable in a single conversation. She was glad of that. Some things needed to be held before they could be set down in the right place. He wrote about you, Garrett said. I know, I read it. He nodded, a small movement carrying a lot of weight. I found the letter about 2 years after he died. My mother didn't know about it. I was never certain whether he meant it to be found or whether he had just left it somewhere, and the finding was incidental. A pause. I carried it for a long time before I knew what to do with it. What made you give it to Vance? He considered this. About 18 months ago, I was assigned to a joint operation that brought me to this base for a logistics briefing. Vance recognized my name from the after-action file, the Kunar file. He asked to speak with me privately. He told me he had been watching your file for years and believed there would be a moment when it mattered. He looked at her steadily. He asked me if I had anything that belonged to you. She thought about Sterling Vance in his office reading a report years ago, making a decision about a person he had never met. He never told me, she said. He said he would tell you when the time was right. He said some things needed to arrive in the right order. She understood this. Information received before you are ready to hold it is often information wasted. I didn't know it would be today, Garrett continued. When the channel traffic came in and I heard Shadow 7, I understood why I was on that ridge. I don't mean that in a mystical sense. I mean that the combination of this canyon and this operation and your aircraft, it was too specific to be coincidental. Someone had constructed the conditions. He paused. I think my father would have found that worth noting. He would have drawn a cartoon about it. Garrett looked at her. Small animals in states of confusion, she said, in the margins of briefing documents. He thought nobody noticed. Something crossed Garrett's face that was not quite a smile but was related to one. He did the same thing on birthday cards. They stood there for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who have said what needed saying and are sitting with it rather than rushing to add more. Then Garrett put out his hand, not with the formality of a military greeting, with the directness of a man offering his hand to someone who has earned it in a way that has nothing to do with rank or ceremony. She took it. In the locker bay off the maintenance quarter, Nora unzipped her flight suit with the slow deliberateness of someone who is not in a hurry to stop being what she has been for the past 3 hours. Her arms were streaked with grime and the faint residue of hydraulic fluid. Her left shoulder ached where the harness had bitten into it during the belly landing, the specific located pain of an injury that had been ignored when it happened and was now making itself known. She was aware of her collarbone in a way that suggested it would be significantly more aware of itself by morning. None of this was important. At the back of her locker, beneath a folded set of civilian coveralls and a worn maintenance manual she had never gotten around to returning, was a small cloth item she had placed there 4 years ago when she first took the position at Holloway, not displayed. Folded small and placed under other things kept the way you keep something that has meaning, but that you are not yet sure you have the right to claim. She reached past the coveralls and took it out. The patch was black cloth with the image of a hawk in flight above a broken star, the thread worn at a few edges, but the image still clean and clear. Shadow 7. The call sign that had been hers and that she had not used and had not allowed herself to think of as hers, and had carried anyway the way you carry things that are true about you, whether or not you have decided to acknowledge them. She turned it over in her hands. The embroidery was rough against her fingertips. She had sewn this herself years ago from a pattern she had made by hand because she had wanted it to be exactly right and had not trusted anyone else to make it exactly right. The hawk was slightly asymmetric, one wing a fraction longer than the other. Not because she had made an error, but because she had corrected the pattern halfway through and decided the asymmetry was more honest than a perfect mirror image. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, which was negligible in the physical sense and considerable in every other. She thought about Warren Holt, not with the weights she had carried for 11 years, the measured, careful weight of a person accounting for a decision made in a moment of pressure. She thought about him with the fullness of actually remembering him, his voice in the radio, the cartoon figures in the margins of mission briefings, the particular quality of his flying in a canyon or over rough terrain, the way he made the aircraft part of a conversation with the landscape rather than an argument with it. The way he had looked at a complicated situation and seen it clearly without flinching from what he saw. His son had the same eyes. She thought about what he had written, about putting it down, about earning the right. She thought about a belly landing on a foam-covered runway, both engines silent, her hands holding the controls to the very end. About a question that had lived in the cockpit for 11 years and had finally, in a canyon in Colorado, received the answer it had been waiting for. Not the answer that erased the original choice. Nothing erased that. But the answer that said the choice was part of you and you carried it honestly and you came back and did what you came back to do. She pinned the patch to the chest of her undershirt. The fabric was warm. She pressed it flat with 2 fingers and felt it settle the way things settle when they have found the place they belong. She was walking across the tarmac toward the hangar when the intercom system that served the entire flight line came to life. Not with an alert tone, not with operational traffic, with the measured, deliberate voice of a controller who had been told what to say and who was saying it with the full understanding of what it meant. The voice carried across the whole base. Shadow 7, Nora Calloway. Welcome home. She stopped walking. The words reached her differently than words usually reached her, not as information, not as instruction, not as the compressed professional language of people communicating under time pressure. They reached her as something else, as acknowledgement, as the specific human act of one person saying to another, "We see you, we know what you did, you can stop carrying it alone." She did not perform a response for the people she knew were watching from the hangars, from behind the barriers, from the windows of the operations building. The ground crews who had nodded as she passed, the slow nod of genuine recognition. The young pilots who had stared with the intensity of people trying to memorize something. The older maintenance technicians who had set down their tools. She simply stood on the tarmac under the Nevada sky and let the words do what they were doing. The sun was fully down. The sky had moved past the amber and the copper and the brief violet that follows them and had arrived at the deep blue-black that pilots know as the sky's true color, the one that exists before the light of day gives it the colors other people see. Stars were beginning in it, faint at first, then brightening as the last traces of the day's light finished their departure. Behind her tail, 707 was in the maintenance shelter being documented and assessed by people who would spend the coming weeks understanding what it had survived and determining what could be restored. She knew the aircraft would fly again. She knew it not from sentiment, but from looking at a thing honestly and seeing what was there. The airframe had been built for exactly what had happened today. It had fulfilled the purpose it was designed for. That kind of thing does not go to waste. She thought about the scar on the nose, about the shark mouth, slightly different on each side, about the 8 rungs of the boarding ladder and the way the harness buckled in sequence and the feel of the throttle under her left hand. She thought about what Garrett had said, that his father believed she would know what to do even when she did not believe she did. She thought about the letter folded in the chest pocket of her flight suit against the fabric, staying warm. Above the base, the sky continued doing what it always did, opening toward the stars, vast and patient, the same sky it had been over every runway she had ever left and returned to. She had flown under it angry and afraid and certain and lost, and today, with a question finally answered. It had held all of that without comment. That was one of the things she had always valued about the sky. It did not editorialize. She was still standing there when Garrett appeared beside her for the last time that night. He did not ask what she was looking at. He simply stood beside her and looked up at the same sky. After a while, he said, "What happens now?" It was a genuine question, not asking for a specific answer, but for the shape of what came next, which was different and harder and better. Nora thought about the flight status form with her signature on it now in Sterling Vance's jacket. About tail, 707 in the shelter behind her, waiting for the work that would make it whole again. About the runways she had landed on tonight and the runways she would land on after it. "Now, Basham," she said, "I go back to work." She looked at the sky for one more moment, at the full dark weight of it, at the stars clear and cold, and numerous the way they were only this far from city light at the horizon where the last warmth of the day was a line that was almost gone. Then she turned and walked toward the hangar. The lights came on ahead of her as she walked one by one, illuminating the path back to the aircraft and the work in the sky that had taken her in and given her back and would take her in again. Behind her, the desert held its ancient silence. Before her, the flight line stretched out bright and awake and waiting. She did not look back.